Today, I'm gonna show you 4 gimbal movements which will help you level up your storytelling and transport the right emotions to the viewer of your videos. So a few weeks ago I created a video on 12 different drone shots for better storytelling, where I go a little bit more depth into how the movements of your drone influence your story. And as that video got a lot of great feedback, I decided to do a similar video on gimbal movements. And that's why today I'm going to show you 4 essential gimbal movements. I'm going to tell you when to use them, and I'm also going to give you a few tips on how to perfectly execute them. But before we jump into the first movement, we're first gonna have a look at the setup. So, for all of the shots in today's video, we are going to use the all-new Zhiyun Crane M3. Zhiyun came out with this tiny gimbal a couple of weeks ago. They sent it out to me and they also sponsored today's video. This might just be the tiniest and most lightweight gimbal I've ever used. This thing only weighs 700 grams. Obviously, the most important question is what kind of cameras can it hold? This thing can hold multiple devices, from a smartphone to an action cam, to APS-C cameras, to full-frame cameras, just like my Sony a7S III. But I think that it is primarily designed for APS-C cameras, and that's why today I'm actually not going to shoot on the Sony a7S III, but on the a6600 of my friend Gabriel. And there it is. This is what the setup looks like. This is so tiny. This is actually crazy. I'm quite excited to shoot on a smaller setup again, because I'm just used to these big and heavy setups. Later, we're also going to test out the Sony a7S III on there, but for the majority of the shoots, we're going to stick to the a6600. I think it's quite interesting to switch it up again, because probably some of you guys also shoot on APS-C cameras, and I myself used to shoot on the predecessor of this camera, the a6500, for more than 3 years, so I know what kind of quality you can get out of these setups if you know how to use them properly. When it comes to the gimbal itself, it has a couple of different features that we know from other gimbals, but also some that are completely new. It comes with a nice little backpack to transport the gimbal, camera and lenses. It has an OLED touchscreen that can be used to change the settings. It has 3 different axis locks if you want to put it into your backpack or just avoid the axis from swinging around. It has a quick release system that lets you quickly mount and dismount the camera without having to rebalance. It has a built-in fill light, which I'm going to test at the end of the video, and the Pro Kit also comes with a microphone that can be attached to the bottom extension of the gimbal. Alright, so now that we know everything about the gimbal and the setup, we're going to start with the first movement. So, why is it called crane? Basically, we're just trying to replicate shots that you would normally only get on these huge crane setups that you see on Hollywood movie sets. And with these movements, you want to keep it subtle, make them clean, make them simple. Don't go too crazy, because these moves are just there to give a little bit of depth to your video without distracting the viewer from what's happening in the scene. For these crane shots, it makes sense to shoot on wide lenses, because then you just see more of the foreground moving in the frame. Also, it makes sense to shoot in slow motion, like 50 FPS or 100 FPS, because then you have the option to slow down your shots in the edits, and that leaves you with a much more stable shot where you have less shakes in it. One of the most common crane shots is a simple rise up where you set your gimbal to lock mode and basically just lift up the camera into the sky. If you want to add a twist to it, you can also slowly pan while rising up with the gimbal and even do a focus shift from your subject to the background. Then there is the basic slider shot where you lock your gimbal and only move sideways. For these shots, you should always find something in the foreground to actually show that the camera is moving.
I would choke, bro. I told you.
Oh yeah, and don't get too close to electric fences. Another cool shot is a rise up while tilting down, as this can create some extra depth in your video and works great for showing a landscape with a character in the foreground. So what I'm basically doing here right now, I'm just in full lock mode, and then I'm using the joystick, because there you can have a much more controlled movement when it comes to the tilt itself. So if I just do it like this, I can really control it. So basically I just move up and then I slowly pull down that joystick, and then you have a really nice rise up with the gimbal tilt down. So when would we use these movements? These crane shots would work really well to establish a scene or to establish a location, because the viewer can just take the time to actually see what's happening in front of the lens instead of being distracted by crazy movements. Also, these shots can create a very calm feeling and slow down the pace in between different scenes. I think I'm gonna climb up here. Yo, look at that beach, hey. Completely white sand, a lot of these rocks here, which are also really great for like gimbal movements because you have some stuff moving in the foreground. Pretty nice here. So when it comes to filmmaking, it always depends on the relation between the camera and the subject. So don't just limit yourself by adding movements to the camera and just running around the subject, but also play around with the movement of your subject itself.
For the first shot, I basically did a simple rise up like before, but now my friend Gabriel entered the frame and walked into the distance. Another good way to introduce your character is to lock your focus at a specific point and then let your subject walk towards you. This shot looks a lot more interesting on high aperture lenses, but obviously it's also harder to nail the focus compared to an f4 lens. You can also walk backwards to get a dolly out movement and let your subject enter the frame while walking towards you.
So shots like these are a very natural and easy way to introduce your subject or your character for the first time in the scene. Most of the time you don't need to shoot more than one of these shots because obviously you don't need to reintroduce your character over and over again. These shots make the viewer feel like there's actually something happening in the scene because they have to look what the character does, how he's moving, is he leaving, is he coming into the frame, and they don't just observe a continuous motion. So that makes the viewer a lot more engaged, and you can also surprise the viewer. Obviously you can also just switch it around and let your subject leave the frame, and that works just as well for closing shots. And you can also just use one of these shots where the subject leaves the frame and then enters again, and then that's a very good transition to a new scene. So when it comes to traveling and going on small adventures, I basically just stopped taking gimbals with me because these huge gimbals are just too heavy and bulky for me to operate and to carry with me. It's just not worth it to me, and therefore I just switched to handheld shots a lot of times. But yeah, I feel like this small gimbal can actually be a gimbal that I'm taking with me on those trips, because if we just look at a full setup with, for example, Zhiyun Crane 2S with the Sony a7S III and a 24 to 70mm lens on it, that would be 3.3 kilograms. While that small thing with the Crane M3, the Sony a6600 and a 10 to 18mm lens is only 1.4 kilograms, which is actually crazy. And I think it's not only a benefit to carry less weight, but also it's really cool to just be able to operate a gimbal with one hand, which you can with this one. Like, I can just switch mode with this, for example, go into vortex mode, and then I can just do like gimbal movements with one hand. Like, I can even vlog while making gimbal shots. So I think that this gimbal might actually be one that I'm taking with me on those shorter trips. So as I said, the relation between you and your subject completely influences what the viewer is going to feel when he looks at your shots. I already said it in my last video where I talked about how to shoot a commercial, that if the camera moves in the opposite direction to the subject, you're not really feeling a connection to the subject because it's just passing by. It's basically the same as if you would walk in a pedestrian way and there's a person passing you by. You probably don't really care about that person, but if you actually walk with another person, like for example your friends, then obviously you care about the other person, and that is something that also happens in filmmaking as well. If you match the motion of your camera to the person you're filming, then the viewer feels like he's actually going on a journey with the character and they feel some sort of connection to them.
As it is with the other movements, there is an infinite amount of possibilities of shots to capture this way. You can follow the person from behind, focus on one specific detail and switch between different focal lengths. Here on the beach, I went for a typical slider shot where I put the gimbal into lock mode and walked parallel to the subject. Another shot I often like to do is a dolly out while reverse following the subject, which means that I have to walk backwards in order to match the movement. We also tried a few other follow shots, which not always worked out.
Acting is more difficult than moving the gimbal, huh? So you would use these shots if you want the viewer to actually feel like he's the character himself, like he's stepping into the shoes of the character, because follow shots just help the viewer identify better with the character and what he's experiencing right now. Therefore, it sometimes also makes sense to shoot these shots in real time instead of slow motion, because then you have even more elements to make it feel natural and realistic to the viewer. Like, for example, with sound design, walking along the beach and you hear the waves in the background, then you can really transport the viewer into the same position as the character themselves.
Muy bueno.
Alright, so now we checked out how the A6600 works on there. It is a really cool setup, to be honest. Now we're just going to throw the Sony a7S III on there, and we're going to see if it is able to actually hold that payload or if it's going to struggle. Let's see. So, it looks quite good. One thing which I recognize already is that if you have the viewfinder cushioning up here, then it's going to touch it. So if you just like detach it up here, then you actually have a lot of movement when it comes to that. And you can move basically any way, and it feels quite strong, to be honest. Don't have any issues yet. I'm going to take a couple of shots and I'm going to see how that works. So, an orbit generally makes most sense when you're filming a subject, because then you can show the subject from its different sides, and also you can give the viewer a much better understanding of the environment where the subject is in. Why is it called orbit? Basically, just like a planet is circling around the sun, you're going to circle with your camera around the subject. Science.
Yes, science!
The cool thing about this movement is that it creates a lot of depth, because the foreground, which is your subject, is going to move a lot slower than the background of the subject. That effect is actually called parallax effect, and you can make it even more intense if you switch to higher focal length. So if you shoot on a tele lens, then the background is going to pass even quicker, but obviously you're also just going to cover a smaller portion of the whole orbit.
So for orbits, it makes a lot of sense to film in pan follow mode in order to get that sidewards movement while keeping the other axis steady. One of the most known orbit shots is the so-called hero shots, where you basically circle around the subject in order to drive more attention towards it. By going a bit lower than the subject, it will appear superior to the viewer and therefore seem even more powerful.
So a small tip when you're orbiting around the person is that the person twists in another direction to your camera movement, because that looks a lot more cinematic, and also you will reveal even more sides of the character. When would you use these shots? These shots are often used to intensify the emotion that the character feels right now. Also, if you keep the subject centered, then you're going to isolate it in its environment. So most of the time, this is kind of like a turning point for the character. They are just kind of like stopping, and they're looking around themselves, and they're just kind of realizing something. So yeah, you can make the experience of the character appear even more intense to the viewer. This is freezing cold. So right now it is almost completely dark. We just have a little bit of glow in the back here, but especially if you're shooting a subject, obviously you don't get any light on the subject itself if you want to have that glow in the background. But we're now going to try to use actually the light of that gimbal. So we just press here on the side and boom, we have light. You can dim it, you can adjust the brightness, and you can also adjust the color temperature. So yeah, we're just going to see what looks good on him. And yeah, we're going to try if that looks cool or if that looks like a freaking news reporter. It has a look that you obviously don't normally see, because normally the subject just wouldn't get any light. But I think if you use it on a very low brightness level, it can actually work out. I got a couple of shots where you just see a bit more detail in Garbo himself, and you don't just see the silhouette. So it can be a cool look. Gotta try out a little bit more in order to see if I actually like it. So I really think that understanding how these movements influence your story is the quickest way to become a better filmmaker. I myself learned these things over the last 10 years of just going out and shooting over and over again, and I hope that I could pass some of this stuff on to you. Hopefully next time when you're out shooting with a gimbal, you're not just like capturing cinematic stuff and then in the edit you're just figuring out what you do, but you're actually thinking about what you want the viewer to feel when he looks at your shots. So, after about a good week of shooting on this gimbal, what are my thoughts on it? To be honest, I was quite surprised that it's actually able to hold the Sony a7S III on it. To be fair, I still think that it is primarily made for APS-C cameras, and I actually think if you're shooting on a Sony a6500 or a Sony a6600, this is the gimbal to get right now. 100%, it is small, it is powerful, and it also has a couple of cool features that you don't get in other gimbals. But I can also actually see myself shooting with the Sony a7S III on this gimbal, and I can see myself taking this gimbal with me on future adventures and trips because it is just so small. I can fit it into my backpack, I can throw the a7S III with prime lenses on it, and it just works out perfectly. If you want to shoot with zoom lenses on it, like the 24-70, it's not perfect because then the motors are not strong enough, but APS-C, this is the gimbal. When it comes to the prices, the gimbal itself costs 399 euros. If you want to get the combo pack with the small backpack, it will cost 489 euros. And if you want to get the Pro Kit with the microphone on top, then you would pay 699 euros. If you want to buy it for yourself, then you can check out the links in the description. Those are affiliate links, so if you buy through these links, you will support me and my channel. Also, I wanted to let you know that Zhiyun is currently doing a mobile film challenge where you have to shoot a video on your smartphone and then you can win amazing prizes up to 10,000 US dollars. So if you want to check that out, you can also find a link for that in the description. That's basically everything for today. I'm going to see you guys in the next one. Peace out. Bye bye.